All right, hello and welcome back to Friday Night Bytes. It's me, Jordan Darling, and with me is another very special guest host, as Scott is still out, and you're in for a treat because joining me today to discuss how ransomware and other threats apply to our school system and the basic ways to safeguard our schools is the CISO of Seattle Public Schools, April Mardock. April, thank you for joining me today.
Hello, hello.
I really appreciate it. And we're going to dive in. And one thing on this show, before we can get into the meat of the discussion, the InfoSec meat, which there's going to be some good stuff, so stick around. We have to dive into the appetizers, and we got to talk about some restaurants. And I'm excited for this one. I've only been to Seattle, April, once. I was there I think it was, I don't remember what year it was, but it was SMB Nation was being held there. And and I went there for that event. And it's a very lovely town. We walked around, we went to a lot of different restaurants. It was a long time ago, but I haven't been since. And I'd like to know how the eating is there. So what restaurant, I'm going to share the screen here, and what restaurant did you bring to the table, no pun intended, today?
Well, as most people know, Starbucks is sort of known as the coffee capital of the world,
Yeah.
Or at least we think we are. But some of the restaurants have taken coffee to yet another level. And this is one of those places. So the Stonehouse Cafe is right along Lake Washington. And if you didn't know, Seattle's a big metro area. It's the largest city in Washington State, and it borders both the Puget Sound, which is a large freshwater lake, and then on the other side, there's some smaller ones. And so there's a lot of water, of property with water visibility and beautiful views. And this restaurant has one of those. And it's built in an old, it's a 1920s gas station that was built out of stone that has been renovated and is being used as a restaurant these days. And they
Like
serve
this
some
right here.
amazing, yeah, they serve some amazing breakfasts and lunches. And they have some pretty cool coffee stuff going on. So if you didn't know, there's a variety of coffee desserts, whether you like your coffee, to drink your dessert or to eat your dessert. But as you can see here, there's a lot of variety for the breakfast. They do try to locally source a lot of their content. Organic is kind of a big deal out here where possible. And then if you scroll down some, you'll see some of the coffee options. And so one of my favorite is the coffee and ice cream underneath white mocha. And I'm not even sure how it's pronounced. I think it's affogato, but it's coffee and it's espresso and ice cream together. So you get the hot and the cold, the sweet, with your view of the water. Great fun, neat place to visit. Can be a little crowded, so make sure you get there with enough time to wait, but it's definitely worth the visit.
That coffee and ice cream sounds magnificent. Those were meant to be together.
They do have some unusual drink combinations as well. So
I wanna see the picture. Oh, there's a picture of the
yep.
So
And there's some other pictures there with the view is actually fairly significant. They look right across the road at Lake Washington itself. And so it's a pretty place to sit. The service is amazing. The ambiance is fun. The food is great. And for me, it's almost walking distance from my house. So,
oh, nice.
Yeah.
Well, I have to say, I think you hit this assignment out of the park. This is a wonderful restaurant recommendation. And I will 100% check it out the next time I'm in Seattle. So
Please do. Their hours are a little weird, so check before you go. They also often host special events. So they'll do like wedding receptions and things like that.
Wonderful. And they have a food truck too.
Oh yeah, I haven't followed up on that. That sounds like they're expanding a little bit, which is cool.
I mean, I in many ways I would love to run a food truck. That sounds like a great time. Driving around, great food. My choice. So if you're ever in this area, which it sounds like you are familiar with the Minnesota area. in your past. But this one I'm bringing today is called Maynards, and it's not Menards. It's Maynards.
Ooh, look at that quesadilla.
Yeah, all right. It's delicious. It's located in Rogers, Minnesota, so it's a little northwest of the metro. Um, and I thought it was the only one in existence, but I know there's a restaurant in Maple Grove too called Malones that I believe is owned by owned by like a family member, and so their menu is essentially the same as Maynard's. And anyways, as I was looking for their site, I saw other Maynards, but I don't know if they're the same. I don't think they are, but there's other Maynards restaurants apparently in the country. But this one in a little town called Rogers, and it's American casual style is what they call it, and it's a lot of good just home cooking. And their menu here, let me see, I already had that up, but so they got sandwiches, burgers, some healthy stuff, some plates.
Healthy-ish.
Yeah, right. They're honest, you gotta be honest when you're in business. But they got a lot of like Minnesota inspired type stuff. So like the walleye sandwich, cranberry wild rice turkey melt. It all sounds very delicious. PB&J burger, that's an interesting one. My favorite is the Firecracker shrimp, and they have it's on the happy hour menu too. So they have a nice happy hour from 3 to 6, good deals on stuff, and ahi tuna and Firecracker shrimp is on that menu too. But if you wanted kind of more of a meal, they also have Firecracker shrimp tacos. And man, I love that Firecracker shrimp so much. I tried to recreate that sauce at my house, and it's just I didn't quite perfect it. But it is delicious. And so again,
hey, it's incremental, just like security, right?
exactly.
We get better every time.
Exactly. You guys just got to get started, do something and then perfect it. But so again, Maynards and Rogers, Malones and Maple Grove, great stuff, and the Stonehouse Cafe in Seattle. So there you go. We're 5 minutes into this podcast and we offered some great value to our listeners. But now we got to get to the main course. And that is what April is here for. She brings some insight and experience. So April, let's dive a little bit more into who you are. You're currently the CISO for Seattle Public Schools. How many users do you serve there?
About 48,000 students and about 7,500 staff. So well over 55,000 folks.
That's a lot. And how long have you been in that role?
In this role, well, CISO only about a year. I've been with Seattle Schools most recently since 2009.
Right on. But this wasn't, I mean, before this, you had 9 years where you were supporting cybersecurity, infotech for 132 different companies. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, I did my billing for each customer, right? And so at the end of the year, I went through and listed the total number of companies I'd served that year. It was 132. It was crazy. And that was mostly small businesses. As you probably know, in the small business sector, you help a lawyer, they tell their lawyer friends. You help a realtor, they tell their realtor friends. You tell a doctor, they tell their doctor friends. And all of a sudden you have a list of folks to help keep them secure. And then did some other work at that point with some other larger orgs too. So it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, once you get a lot of referrals. Once you become someone's person, you're like, hey, do you got a computer guy? You got a security guy? Yeah. And then your name gets passed around, and so that means that you're making some moves. And it seems like, from what I know about you, it seems like you're kind of the fighter. Maybe that's not a good word. Advocate.
I'm a firefighter, cybersecurity firefighter.
Firefighter in the cybersecurity, but really for those that are trying to defend today's security threats with very limited resources. You have
Absolutely.
like small
Absolutely. I'm all
business.
for what you can do inexpensively with very few resources. Keep in mind for some of our smaller K-12s, it might be the science teacher who's also the IT guy, right? We've got folks that 75% of the school districts are like under 5,000 kids. So most of the schools, and some of them are far, far smaller than that, right? Under 1,000 kids. So you have to think about the fact that these districts often don't have even fully dedicated IT staff, let alone cybersecurity staff. So how do you make it approachable? And so
Right.
what I realized is there's a lot of commonality between especially smaller school districts and small businesses where they just don't have the dedicated resources.
Yeah, they have the same threats.
They do. They absolutely do. They are at risk in many of the same ways, for many of the same reasons, right? They want to try to make it as expedient as possible for their users to get what they need done. They want to make sure that everything is accessible wherever they are. They want to make sure that it's easy, right, and straightforward, and doesn't get in the way of teaching or doing business. So
Yeah.
that's kind of where this started. And thanks for bringing up the assessment. If you hit after you, well, we can talk about this here in a second.
Yeah, yeah. Just tell me. Let's dive a little bit more into that passion. Like where the passion that you have for small business, nonprofits, schools, people with little resources. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so what happened was a lot of folks would come to me and go, I don't even know where to start. This is just so overwhelming. It feels like it's hopeless before I've even begun. And they really were like, I have a little bit of time and a little bit of resource to put on this. I mean, I'm talking no budget and maybe a couple of days of work, right? I don't have a huge ability to take this on. So what can you do to make this easier for me? And I was trying to think through how to give them an assessment that was weighted so that the important stuff would kind of pop to the top and help them understand what they really need to focus on to be able to actually make a difference. Because if you think about it, and we'll talk more about this later, there's really three main entry points for the bad guys that I've seen when I've talked to folks about how the bad guys got in after the fact, right? Because Seattle schools is safe right now, but I could be next on the list, right? So
Yeah.
I'm always looking for ways to make my organization safer. And one of the ways I can do that is by talking to organizations that have become victimized.
Yeah.
And what part of that resulted in was an understanding that there's a couple of core things that any size business or organization needs to think about doing for their stuff. One of them is removing those admin rights from the users, because one of the ways the bad guys get in is they send a phishing mail, they send a fake virus alert might pop up, or you might get something that is tempting to click on. And some of the attacks don't even require a click. That's even scarier.
Right.
And if you've allowed admin rights on that machine, the bad guys can then immediately turn off antivirus and sink their little teeth into that machine, and they can use it to spread to other machines and cause more havoc, right?
Yeah.
So
And
that
sometimes
admin right thing is a big deal.
yeah. And then there's a lot of learning curve to that because there's a lot of folks that might push back because they've lived their whole life being able to do whatever they want on their computer, and they view that change as holy cow, you're now I'm inefficient because now I can't do all the things that I want to do.
Right. And
um
so part of that's risk management. And where I've been able to sort of talk them off the edge of the cliff on that is to say, okay, I'm going to give you a different account. And when you need to do those special admin things, which isn't that frequent, you use this other account, and then you get back off of that other account and use your regular account for your mail and your web browsing so
mhm.
that they can still self-service. They don't have to call me. I don't have to come visit. They can still do what they need to do, but they are at much less risk because they're not always running with admin rights.
Right.
So that's one example. And that is huge because that's one of the ways that those phishing emails that you can't stop them all. You just can't. The bad guys keep coming up with more and more clever ways to play that game.
Yeah.
One of those other common entry points that we'll talk about is MFA, and a combination of if you don't have multi-factor authentication for your logins, and that's become cheap, easy, and almost built in for most folks these days. It's available whether you're Google, whether you're Microsoft, all kinds of options there. Is if you allow remote access, if you allow somebody to VPN in or remote in from anywhere, and you don't have that multi-factor authentication, here's the problem. So many of our users, my users, I have 50,000 of them, right? have used web services. Evite is an example. We can talk about a different website later, perhaps. It's called Have I Been Pwned? But you put your email in there and they'll tell you all the places where your username and your password has probably been stolen from.
Mm-hmm.
Evite, when they got broken into, the passwords were stolen in clear text. Guess how many of my 7,500 staff users used the same username, their email address at Seattle schools, and the same password at Evite? It was a number, right? And I bet that's true for lots of other school districts and lots of other businesses across the US. Is
Yes.
those passwords were stolen, easily visible. It doesn't require cracking of any kind. Here's the email address, here's the password. They take that email address and password and they use it all over the place, right? And if they can then get remote access into my district or into any organization, then they have rights to do whatever they want to, as if they were sitting inside the building on your machines. Make sense?
Yeah.
And so that's another. So if you can remove admin rights and make people use MFA at least for remote access, and preferably everything, but at least for remote access, those are big pieces. And then the last one isn't really for the smallest organization, because most of them aren't really providing servers that are exposed to the internet, but your medium-sized and larger organizations have this problem more, I think, which is, well, I should qualify that. If you put a server at, let's say it's a web server or it's got some special service and you've exposed it to the internet, or worse, you play games on those machines and you've exposed that server to the game ports, or terror of terrors. I had some companies do this that were real small and they use the same computer for gaming and not gaming, right? They punched a hole in their firewall that said DMZ, and they put their computer name or their computer address in that DMZ port for the router. And now all the internet traffic was allowed access to that PC, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's bad, especially if that PC is not patched, because if it's not patched and there's attacks available, they can then reach in through that connection and take over that machine.
Mm-hmm.
Case in point, in K-12, we use a CIS called PowerSchool. And there was an attack that came out using Adobe, I think it was Struts. This was several years back. And if you didn't patch your server or you didn't put a device in front of your server to protect it from attacks, those are called web application firewalls. And so that could maybe be a shield for your server, even if your server wasn't patched. But if you put a server out there and you didn't patch it and it had this flaw, the bad guys could come in through that server and they would immediately begin attacks. And they could ransom that server, they could spread through your network, they could create all kinds of chaos because that exposed server. And remember, school districts have, in the early days especially, put up those servers so parents and students could get to their homework and get to their grades from home. They could check on their library fines. They have all kinds of legitimate reasons to put services out there, but they need to keep that stuff patched, right? And that's true for businesses too. If you've got something that's exposed, but here's this part that's a little bit more of a hassle. You really need to be patching your computers and your applications as well, because what the bad guys are figuring out, here's an example, not even a month ago, the bad guys figured out that they could send around RTF files, right? Little RTF files that could invoke a bug inside Microsoft Word that could actually attack your machine and cause it harm just because of that flaw inside Word. And it gave them like system level rights, right?
Yeah.
And so it gave them terrible things. And you could patch, you could fix Word, you could make that problem go away, but you had to stay on it, right? You had to keep that stuff patched. And so those three things are big. Admin rights, take them away, please, and just give them an account that lets them do that when they need it. Please use MFA, especially for remote access or VPN. And then anything that's exposed needs to be patched, and that includes workstations, but especially servers.
Yeah. Yeah, we're no stranger to talking about some of those things here. It really is the basics, right? We hear this. I mean, we hear it all the time, you and I, in the communities we're in and stuff. But man, it does seem like that word still needs to get out to the average Joe, the people that aren't in our worlds. Maybe sometimes we feel like I sometimes feel like, man, we've been preaching this for so long. Doesn't everyone know it by now?
And sometimes it's a matter of culture too. It is hard to remove admin rights once you've given them, right? To your point, the culture can be a challenge and you need support. Sometimes it's not a technology fix, it's a culture fix, and that can be hard. And
So
we
real
need to help give them the ammunition and the support to be able to make their case, right?
exactly. Yeah, and real quick, let's talk a bit about
To
your
finish
assessment.
this. Yeah, so this is basically a way of looking at the risks for an organization and then going through and ranking that and providing a final report that says, okay, here's what you need to focus on. This one is 50 questions and it's kind of universal. It'll work for any org if you kind of just wear a slightly, as you step through this, this is designed for K-12, but as you read it, most of this applies to any organization, right?
Right.
Now, I will say, I got challenged by a friend. His name's Doug Levin. He runs this website actually. And he said, you don't quite understand it yet. This is walk and run level stuff. I need crawl level stuff. I need really simple basics for those super small districts, those one-man shops. And so what he had me do was help work with a bunch of other K-12 administrators to create a 12-question version of this that's even simpler. So, but yeah, if you hit the go on this, you'll see
I'll pull up
a
my
final report.
I
What's
actually
that?
I did this already and I have a PDF. Here we go.
Oh, there you go. So this is intended to call out the critical stuff to the top of the report, and it'll tell you where to go and what to do, right? Um, and actually, I think I need to update that link. It moved, but if you keep going down, in some cases we provide, oh, I see. So you did an actual test. So there's only one that's marked as urgent. And then the others note some concerning things that you should focus on. So that hopefully gives you a, here's what maybe I should be focusing on now, right?
Yeah.
And then we break it out in the NIST framework down below and tell you how many points you got and where you need to make some improvements. If you have more resources or more time, this would help you actually put together a full cybersecurity plan.
Yeah, I really like that. I like
But
how
that urgent stuff's popped up to the top so that
yeah.
you know if you're limited on time and energy, that's what you really need to focus on.
Yeah. So in this case with my test I took it right away, it pops to the top. You need an MFA.
Yep. Yep. MFA is a big deal. It's a big deal.
So if you do anything, you do one thing, spend $1 on one thing, it should probably start with MFA, you know, in
Well,
this.
because you have to assume that your usernames and passwords have been stolen or reused, right? And at that point, how do you keep the bad guys from using that account to then log in as that user? And they can see everything that user can see. They can see not just mail, they can see SharePoint or OneDrive or file shares. Anything that you've made available to that user can potentially be seen by that bad actor who's logging in as that person if you don't have MFA in place.
Mm-hmm.
And I know a lot of folks said, well, I'll just make sure that, international access is turned off, for instance. Well, the bad guys have figured that out, and they're now proxying and connecting through what look like US IP addresses and representing themselves as if they're in the US, even if they're not. So
Very cool. I mean, and I mean, I think this is great that you're offering tools like this. And Scott and I have talked about this in past episodes. Like this is one of those things where there are people in this world trying to provide free resources for people to be able to do this, and you're one of them. So I really appreciate that about you. And and so and I'm going to put a link to this in the show notes. So and to your point, the language in this is about schools, but it's
it
applies.
applies to pretty much any organization. Now, I will say that this is a couple years old. There are some new assessments coming out. I think there's going to be something coming out from CISA. They put out their common performance goals, which is a list of kind of cybersecurity baseline requirements. They are pushing to make this more available, more visible, and making more people aware. The folks who do the CIS 18 cybersecurity standards have come out with a simplified version called the IG1. And they have assessments for that as well that are also sort of this approach, try to get it a little bit more manageable, because some of the old assessments would take you half a day and you still didn't really have anything you could take action on when you were done. Right? This is intended to give you some very specific guidance, some very specific places to go for help, some very specific steps to take. So
Yeah, and it really all starts there. I mean,
yep.
I've heard it quite a bit in this industry and in our community, infosec communities, that it all starts with an assessment. You kind of have to know where you're at instead of just throwing money at the next tech
shiny
thing.
toy, shiny
Right.
tool. Yeah. And there's no silver bullet. I don't care what the vendors tell you, this whole zero trust concept. There is no single product you can buy that will make your life perfect in terms of cybersecurity. You still need to cover the basics.
Absolutely.
So
Shifting gears just a bit, before we get into kind of some practical things about schools, I love the quote that you have, at least I think it was maybe from that Blue Team book that you
yeah.
sent to me, but which you define Blue Team as everyone involved in the defense of the cyber business assets. So anyone involved in that, and the quote was that you, April Mardock, believe that empathy for the end user and persistence to push through the necessary changes are the two core capabilities that a blue team should have.
Yes. And to
Can
be
you tell me
fair,
more
my
about?
bias is small and medium businesses kind of in that concept, and
Yeah.
smaller school districts, because in the bigger districts, you kind of push the the change agent upstream to the executive staff, right? Or to the CISO in my case. But really, in a smaller organization, you're it. So you're responsible for both interfacing with the user and making the change, or helping have activate the change, right?
Mm-hmm.
So earlier when we were talking about administrator rights, right? I need empathy with the user. I don't want to break their daily work. I want to make it possible for them to do business. I want them to be able to self-serve. I want to be understanding of their needs, but at the same time, I want to push them to make the change to not do admin rights all the time, especially not when they're doing email and when they're on the web, right? So
Mm-hmm.
finding that balance between imposing security restrictions that might get so onerous that it stops being functional for the business. So yes, I love this cartoon. I actually paid for the license to use this cartoon because I thought it was so real. My car is equipped with with an alarm and a motion detector and a theft inhibitor and a voice activated sensor. And his friend says, "So what's the problem?" And he says, "I can't get near it." You can overprotect it to that point where it defeats the purpose. So really, cybersecurity management, in my opinion, is about risk management and finding that balance between the attacks impact, we call it sort of the blast radius, and how likely it is to happen to me, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what helps you decide what to focus on, where to spend your energy, is how awful it would be if it happened and how likely it is to actually occur.
Yeah.
We call that sort of manage risk. And so we don't try to solve it all. We just try to focus on those things that matter.
Great. And I mean, I really love keeping empathy for the end user in focus, because we really can cripple them sometimes, and just empathy from the other side of it too, which is that this is a person that can bad things can happen to them,
Mm-hmm.
and and uh and it's in many ways,
They're a victim of a crime in some
right.
cases, right? So whether it's a business or an individual, they're victims in this game. And unfortunately, it's hard to keep that in mind when you're trying to deal with the repercussions of whatever happened. Um, so yeah, empathy is a big part of this, and I think empathy helps with telling the story and helping people understand you care about the business impact of your choices. They trust that you're not going to basically overreact and over control and become the dragon in the corner, but rather you're enabling them to be safe, and you're trying to take steps to put them in a better place and still keep them functional.
Yes.
Oh, this is a scary map.
Yeah,
Yes.
tell me about this. This is something you guys put together.
No, I did not. This is credit to Doug Levin. He runs K-12-6, which is what they call an ISAC. It is a place for essentially information sharing of cybersecurity threats in the K-12 space. He's actually been doing this for quite a while. This is the K-12 cybersecurity incident map. Unfortunately, Seattle Schools is on here, but it's not on here because of what we did. One of our local service agencies had data about our teachers and they got taken over, and that data affected every school district in sort of our area of the state. And so if you drill in on Seattle schools, you'll see us on there, which makes me very sad. But it isn't due to anything that we did or didn't do. However, there were several schools in my area, school districts, that did have ransomware events, and they're on this map. Moses Lake is an example of one that's a bit east of us. There was another one just north of us. Yeah, if you click on that one. So he actually, everything that's on here has a public, it's in the news and has been essentially publicly announced. Not all ransom events have been made public, I will tell you that.
Mhm.
But he's basically got the details on each school district's event and where it was published.
Yeah.
And so school districts across the US are being targeted by bad actors who think they can make money. And to be fair, there's several ways this happens. One is just random attack. The bad guys are basically sending out trolling fishes, right, all the time, looking for victims. The bad guys are doing robot attacks on those exposed servers all the time. So if a server is left up and gets attacked because it wasn't patched, that can be another way that they get in. And the other way that they'll get in is sometimes with far more directed attacks. We've actually had bad guys clone our website and try to get credentials that way. We've had bad guys fake invoices from a vendor that was compromised and try to get money that way. There's a lot, and we'll talk a little bit later about all the different kinds of threats, but there's a lot of them.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, school districts actually have a lot more money than most people realize because we build school buildings, and part of the construction budget is in play here.
Yeah, and so also on this list, for those of us here in the Twin Cities, we're very familiar with the recent event to the Minneapolis public school system, and it was pretty messy. And this is, I mean, this is real. We don't have to go into the details of this story on this episode here, but we were talking about it earlier, and it's just sad the things that get exposed and the things that are at stake.
Yeah, it was an unfortunate situation. Again, Minneapolis was the victim of a crime, right? And I'm trying to avoid the same fate. I don't want to be the next in line because the bad guys are realizing that there's money to be made in this space. And Minneapolis didn't pay, but I know many other school districts have, which is makes it difficult because the bad guys see a return on their investment, right? But unfortunately, it's a reminder, and Minneapolis has helped us think through a couple of other things. You'll notice in their news article about their response, they've talked about a couple things they're doing differently. They're installing some new advanced antivirus tools that basically can't be turned off if you have admin rights. Remember, we were talking about that threat with admin rights. If admin rights are allowed, you can turn off antivirus. Well, Minneapolis is buying a system, a really sophisticated antivirus that can be better about detecting patterns in threats. It might be able to detect a port scan rather than waiting for an actual event to occur. It's much more proactive in its ability to see a threat and intercept it. And then the other thing Minneapolis is doing now is they've moved to 24/7 monitoring of their cybersecurity. I'm not sure if they had it before or not, but they did call it out as part of what they're paying for now. Which to me implies they maybe didn't have it before. I will say with the districts I've talked to, a lot of their attacks happen on weekends or holidays.
Right.
And when the bad guys break in on a weekend or a holiday, they have a long period of time where nobody's watching the alerts to get in, move around, steal data, and then start planting their little ransomware bombs, right? And so if you can get on it, and that's something Seattle Schools does, we have someone who monitors 24/7. They can actually take action on our behalf and lock down a machine or a user that's misbehaving. And then we can follow up on Monday, and this thing hasn't had time to spread because it was stopped. So Minneapolis is reminding all of us that that's something we need to do is 24/7 coverage. And I think that's an important thing for other schools to keep in mind beyond the three basics we talked about, the admin rights, the MFA, and the patching. So
Absolutely. So that leads us then to, I want to get a little bit more into just some specific things, your thoughts on threats for the schools and things. Because I think this is important. I think, the average people, there's some takeaways to have here because we all have been to school, we're all are in school, been to school, or have someone in school, or know someone in school. And so it's interesting to talk about these threats that are very real.
These threats and combinations, yes.
What kind of threats do schools currently face? What are some of their, and what are some of their biggest weaknesses?
So threats in schools are very interesting. We talked about the ransomware threat, where the bad guys, their first target is to get into the district in some way, either through a user, through a server, through an exposed service like a VPN or remote access. And they try to get their teeth in through that one landing point. And then they dig into that machine and they start looking for ways to spread around the network, right? They're trying to look for methods of moving laterally. And then they start looking to steal data, and that's kind of their mode, is to dig in. So my goal is to try to keep them from landing in the first place. And so part of that is, how do we prevent those methods of attack? School districts get targeted in a variety of ways. Ransomware is one of them, but there are several others. As I mentioned before, phishing is a very interesting one. Seattle schools had this come up, where the bad guys took a copy of our posted school board documents. They took the conflict of interest section, and they then used they repackaged it as a PDF and put it behind what looked like a clone of our website. So it had our colors and our logo. And they prompted for a username and a password. And they sent this mass email to, and you can find, it doesn't take much digging on our website, unfortunately. We're working on that. That's it. We expose email addresses on our website. And so I believe they harvested a bunch of the emails from that website, and they used it to target this copy of our board policy document, front-ended by a clone of our website. And they collected usernames and passwords when they did that. We caught it pretty quickly. We caught it after, I'd say, about 20 people hit it, because we're paying attention to alerts at all times.
Sure.
And we got it stopped, and then we forced those users to change their credentials. But it's, for larger orgs especially, the bad guys will take the time to clone your stuff and make it look the same, right? They'll copy your stuff. But even for a smaller school district, every one of us, every small school district or small org often posts official documents like policies or some sort of official document that could be used, then represented to the employees as something they need to read or follow up on, right? And so that's one interesting way that the bad guys attacked. Another attack that we saw was an attempt at sending an invoice that was where they had changed. I believe they broke into one of the vendors that we did business with. They stole a collection of documents which included previous purchases that we had with that vendor, and the back and forth about who to talk to and the kind of POs and stuff and the process that we used. And they faked it. They picked a domain name that looked very similar with a minor misspelling. Then they sent this fake invoice, and we didn't fall for it, thankfully, because we have lots of checks and balances in place. But it was with a vendor we trusted, with the paperwork that we expected. Everything looked right, but they had changed the banking information, and they'd asked to change the bank routing information, right? So they tried to play that game. And again, construction of schools is a lot of money. There often is a lot of dollars that can be stolen, especially if it looks like a construction related invoice. Several school districts nationwide have fallen for this little scam, where the bad guys are trying to pretend to collect on a construction related bill, if that makes sense.
So you talked about checks and balances. You talked about checks and balances. So in that scenario,
we have a phone number that we call. We don't look at what's on the receipt. Well, I won't talk about all the methods, but one of them is the folks who work in the accounts payable department always verify with known agents on canned phone numbers and contact information about any kind of change like that. And we often require even more than that, but there's all kinds of checks and balances for, like, the other thing that the bad guys are doing is they're trying to get payroll redirected for employees, right? So they'll send in a help request and ask for assistance getting payroll redirected to a different location. Now, if you've exposed what we call employee self-service. A lot of school districts did this. They exposed employee self-service to the outside so people could do their time card, especially during the pandemic. They could record their time online, right? They could change their bank deposit information online. Well, the bad guys, again, that's another thing where MFA is a big deal. If you didn't have MFA and the bad guys stole your username and password, they could log into the employee self-service system and change where payroll went.
Yeah. Man.
It's just bad. And so that's another target. Another way that they target schools is they try to get us to send them W-2s for employees, pretending to be either the employee or some other agency, so that they can file fake taxes on behalf of the employees.
Mm-hmm.
And so then the employees don't even realize it's happened until they go to file their own taxes and find out that that was that somebody had their W-2 information and filed on their behalf. Again, that has not happened to us. We have checks and balances to try to make sure that that doesn't occur. We trust but verify. But if you aren't taking those extra steps to follow up, usually either in person or with information or passkeys or something that is special that was arranged early. Never trust an email message for this kind of request, whether it's a payroll redirection or payment, with things of that kind of nature, where you're changing either bank deposit information or banking or payment related stuff. You really need extra checks and real people in the loop.
Yeah, and I think one key takeaway there is that the idea of awareness of what the request is, so having people trained that when it's a request like this involving change of payment and things like that, you have to follow some sort of different protocol. You have
to assume it could be a bad guy. So what do you do to make sure that, to vet that it's not a bad actor pretending, right? Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, we're in that place where we have to assume ill intent and verify appropriately. Because again, stealing paychecks, stealing tax refunds via W-2, stealing payment for a vendor that we have a legitimate, what we thought was a legitimate invoice for it. Thankfully, we have not fallen for that, but we're a larger district. We have more processes and protocols in place. So one of my goals in this discussion is to help smaller districts think about that. What might they do to better protect themselves about threats like this? Because they're also building buildings, right? They also have W-2s and payroll deposits, and all of us are moving to online payroll deposits. I don't think there's many districts left that are doing checks. So
yeah. So you kind of mentioned some things on this already, but I'm interested in also like what is at stake, what could happen, and specifically what I'm thinking is, why should the public, parents, teachers, school leaders, governments, infosec leaders care, about the cybersecurity of the school system?
At multiple levels, right? One is the bond rating can be affected, because if you have a construction related invoice fraud and you've got dollars that have been stolen, your ability to protect those resources is compromised, and you could find that your bond rating is dropped, right? So it'll cost the voters more to build that same building, because the bond rating is sort of like an interest rate. It's sort of a fine that gets attached. It's a bit like your interest rate might be higher because your credit score is low. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So the same kind of thing happens to a school. Another piece of that is the kind of data that schools have. So they have everything a regular business does. We have things like payroll, right? So there's that W-2 stuff we were talking about for tax related fraud. We have sensitive information like discipline records, both for staff and for students, right? So discipline record information can be in there. In some cases, not all districts do this, there are social security numbers. If you've kept records for more than 20 years, the US government used to require that we have student social security numbers when we were doing grant reports, because you'd say this student was given these resources and they would tag the student with a social security number back in the day. They don't do that anymore. That's not okay. But districts that have those old records may have social security numbers for kids from a long time ago if they haven't purged that content. We also have social security numbers for anyone who does business with us through a W-9. So vendors, especially small single, let's say, well, hopefully you don't, but anyone who's a sole proprietor might be using their social security number for their W-9. right? So if they get the W-9s, they get the social security numbers of those sole proprietors. So these are the kinds of information pieces that people don't realize. I mean, the school district is a business like many others. And then, of course, we have the student data itself. We have the parent's home email, the parent's home phone number. We have the student's home address. We have great information. I mean, some of that is debatable as to how valuable a bad guy can make it and extort from it, but especially things like the one that some of the stuff we saw with Minneapolis, right? Look at how sensitive some of that content was, and the threat of having that exposed is pretty awful, right? And some of it's investigative work, and maybe the final result was that person they have a final result, and all the notes that go behind it, that before they had made a decision and knew all the details, could be even misleading content, right? So there's
Right.
that too.
Yeah, and we just you think about it, and you touched on this when we were talking earlier, that even students coming out of school maybe already having their identity compromised in some way. We had a interview with a for an internship, someone who's just getting out of school, and he told us that when he was younger, he had his identity stolen. Someone wiped out his bank account, and he just went, a student struggling to have any money at all, and he went to just go have some ice cream with some friends, and he had no money anymore. And it's like, I mean, what a sad thing. And so our kids, our future
Yeah,
is at
yeah,
stake.
and a lot of folks are worried about the potential credit impact on students in the future. But I think there's so many layers to the threats. It's kind of amazing because we have both regular business issues and we have those student-related data issues. So, and our vendors. I think you're going to see in this next report coming out of K-12-6 that vendors are more than 50% of the student data breaches. It's not the
Right.
school districts, because we've moved most of our stuff to the cloud now. Well, who's the cloud? The cloud is another vendor doing business out to some degree outside of our control. Most of us have data sharing agreements to try to control, that the vendor's following best practice, and they delete our stuff when they're done, and they'll notify us on breach, things of that nature. But really, we've moved a lot of that to the vendors, and the vendors need to pick up. I'm starting a bit of an investigation into vendors that have externally visible bad practice, like they don't have good SPF records for mail, standard kind of hygiene stuff, or that are publicly, you can tell they don't patch on a regular basis. We really ought to be considering whether we should be doing business with vendors that have bad practice.
Yeah. Yeah, and you see that in the assessment that you put together too, like right away answering questions like, do you at least have a record of what vendors you're working with that might have access to this, and might, and are you aware of their cyber practices? Starting with even just that.
Well, and there's the data they host, and then their access to your network. A lot of districts allow vendors VPN access, right? Well, you should be MFAing that in some form or fashion, and you should be turning off those accounts when you don't do business with that vendor or that individual anymore.
Yeah.
And getting good habits around turning off accounts is also helpful.
So
Because the vendors, if you didn't know, also get attacked. And when the vendors get attacked, sometimes the bad guys sneak in through the vendors' access into schools also.
yeah, and we could have another whole episode on third party risk, and
Yeah.
so, it's real and it's big. But let's bring it home here. It's time for us to kind of wrap up. So give us your April Mardock, how can we safeguard our schools?
The big three, right? As mentioned before, making sure stuff stays patched, whether it's server or workstations. Make sure that you're using MFA, especially if you're off-site for staff. And then, at a basic level, no admin rights. I'm sorry. We can give you an admin account, but you really should not be browsing the web and reading email with administrator rights. It's unfortunately way too easy for the bad guys to defeat the safeties and use that machine for nefarious purposes. And then at that next level, like I said, somewhat in thanks to Minneapolis, a reminder to all school districts that we should be watching our alerts 24/7, preferably with the ability to remotely isolate those machines or those users using more advanced tools. So that the bad guys don't have time to spread and do nefarious stuff while we're on holiday break or whatever.
Yeah.
Those are kind of the big takeaways for me that really all districts, and to be fair, pretty much everybody needs to think about.
Nothing spoils your spring break than having some sort of an incident while you were trying to have a little bit of time.
And they do time it. I've seen it, we actually do see small attacks because we have these kind of systems in place. They get isolated very quickly. But it's amazing to watch the timing of when they try to do stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Well, hey, April, I really appreciate it. This was good stuff. And you're welcome back here anytime. Would you come back sometime?
Yeah, I think it would be a good conversation as we maybe when we start talking about third party risk management. There's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, and I know my co-host Scott would love to meet you and would love to talk your ear off as well. So,
But I will, one last thing is if I can make a call out to all K-12s, think about hooking up with a peer group, folks that you can share your horror stories with. You can talk confidentially about those threats, what you've seen, maybe tell others so that we can stay out of the same trouble. The ISACs are great. MS ISAC, K-12-6, there's some groups that are confidential that you get together, you have a safe place to talk and share so that we can help each other.
Excellent. Perfect. Thank you for that. And all of the resources that April talked about and shared here will be in the show notes. So be sure to check those out and tune in next time to Friday Night Bytes. We'll see you then.